Panic clawed at her throat as stilettos snapped against polished marble. She slammed her hand against the elevator button, glancing over her bruised shoulder. Deacon was coming. Blood roared in her ears as the brass doors finally slid open. She threw herself inside, desperate for a sanctuary, completely oblivious to the cold, calculating eyes waiting in the shadows of the cab. She thought she was escaping a monster, never realizing she had just locked herself in a cage with a king. The Diamond Charity Gala at the St. Regis, New York, was supposed to be a night of philanthropic posturing, a glittering facade masking the ruthless ambitions of Manhattan's elite. For Chenoa Iverson, it was a gilded prison. The chandeliers above cast a dazzling, fractured light over the ballroom, illuminating the silk and diamonds, but failing to reach the dark, bruised reality hidden beneath the sleeve of her couture gown. Deacon Smith, a senior partner at the prestigious private equity firm Oaktree Capital, stood beside her, his fingers curled around her waist in a grip that looked affectionate to the untrained eye but felt like a vice. His smile was flawless, a practiced flash of white teeth for the photographers and potential investors, but the words he murmured into her ear were laced with venom. "Smile, Chenoa," Deacon hissed, his thumb pressing punishingly into her ribs. "You look like a hostage. Do not embarrass me tonight. We have the Volkov account on the line." Chenoa forced the corners of her mouth upward, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had spent the last 2 years slowly suffocating under Deacon's control. It had started with subtle isolations, a comment about her friends, a critique of her career as a forensic accountant, and escalated into sudden, terrifying bursts of violence. Tonight, however, the stakes were entirely different. Earlier that evening, while retrieving a compact from Deacon's briefcase, she had seen the ledgers, the real ledgers. Deacon wasn't just managing high-yield portfolios, he was washing hundreds of millions for an Eastern European syndicate. "I need to use the restroom," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to keep it steady. Deacon's eyes, a cold, flat blue, narrowed. "You have 2 minutes. If you aren't back before the champagne toast, you'll regret it." The moment his grip loosened, Chenoa turned and walked toward the opulent corridor, fighting the urge to sprint. Her pulse drummed a frantic rhythm in her temples. She knew with absolute certainty that if she went back to that table, she would never leave his penthouse alive. He had caught her lingering over the briefcase. She had seen the flicker of suspicion in his eyes. Rounding the corner past the coat check, the facade crumbled. She kicked off the agonizingly high stilettos, scooping them into her hands, and began to run. The thick plush carpet silenced her frantic footsteps, but the heavy rustle of her silk dress echoed in the quiet hallway. "Chenoa!" The sharp bark of her name shattered the silence. She dared a glance backward. Deacon had followed her. The mask of the suave financier was gone, replaced by a contorted mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He was moving fast, his long legs eating up the distance between them. "Come back here, you stupid bitch!" he roared, no longer caring who heard him. Tears of pure terror blurred her vision. She rounded another corner, her lungs burning, and saw the gleaming brass doors of the private VIP elevator at the end of the hall. She sprinted toward it, her stocking-clad feet slipping slightly on the transition from carpet to polished marble. She slammed her hand against the call button, hitting it repeatedly in a frantic, useless rhythm. "Please, please, please." Footsteps pounded behind her, growing louder, heavier. Deacon was closing in. With a soft, melodic chime, the brass doors slid open. Chenoa didn't look to see who or what was inside. She simply threw her weight forward, tumbling into the mahogany-paneled cab. She hit the back wall hard, dropping her shoes, and desperately lunged for the control panel to press the door close button. Before her fingers could brush the metal, a massive, impeccably tailored arm blocked her path. Chenoa froze, her breath catching in her throat as she looked up. The elevator was not empty. Standing in the center of the cab was a man who seemed to swallow all the light in the small space. He was dressed in a bespoke charcoal Brioni suit that draped flawlessly over a broad, powerfully built frame. His face was a study in harsh angles and shadowed hollows, a strong, aristocratic jaw, a straight nose, and eyes so dark they were indistinguishable from the black of a starless sky. He radiated an aura of quiet, absolute lethality. To his right stood another man, broader, heavily muscled, and brutally scarred, his hand resting casually inside his jacket. Chenoa backed away, pressing herself flat against the polished wood of the elevator wall. She had traded a predator for a demon. Before the man could speak, the elevator doors, which had begun to slide shut, were violently jolted open. Deacon's hand, red-faced and panting, shot through the gap, stopping the doors in their tracks. "Got you!" Deacon snarled, stepping halfway into the elevator, his eyes fixed entirely on Chenoa. He reached for her hair, completely oblivious to the other occupants. "You're coming with me right now." He never made contact. The scarred man moved with terrifying speed. A massive hand shot out, clamping around Deacon's wrist. The crack of bone was loud, sharp, and sickening. Deacon shrieked, dropping to his knees as his wrist was bent backward at an impossible angle. The polished veneer of the Wall Street hotshot vanished into the pathetic wail of a broken man. The man in the charcoal suit did not flinch. He didn't even blink. He looked down at Deacon with an expression of profound boredom, as one might look at a cockroach they were about to step on. "Matteo," the man said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, heavily laced with a smooth, dangerous Italian accent. It was a voice used to giving orders that were never questioned. Matteo effortlessly shoved Deacon backward, sending the financier sprawling onto the marble floor of the hallway. "Get out of my elevator," the man in the suit commanded softly. Deacon, clutching his ruined wrist, looked up, his face pale with agony and sudden realization. He recognized the man standing before him. The blood drained entirely from Deacon's face, leaving him a sickly, chalky white. "Mr. Santoro," Deacon stammered, scrambling backward on the floor like a crab. I apologize. I didn't realize." Domenico Santoro, the undisputed head of the most powerful Cosa Nostra family on the eastern seaboard, didn't bother to reply. He simply shifted his gaze to Matteo. Matteo hit the button, the brass doors slid shut, sealing the three of them in a heavy, insulated silence, leaving Deacon's whimpers behind. Chenoa slid slowly down the wall until she hit the floor, pulling her knees to her chest, trembling so violently her teeth chattered. She stared at Domenico Santoro, the name echoing in her mind like a death knell. She had fled the devil, only to seek shelter in the arms of the Reaper himself. The elevator hummed as it began its ascent, not down to the lobby, up. Chenoa watched the digital floor indicator climb, 24, 25, 26, each number feeling like another nail in her coffin. The silence in the cab was absolute, heavy with the scent of expensive cedarwood cologne, ozone, and the faint, unmistakable metallic tang of gunpowder. Domenico stood perfectly still, his hands resting lightly in his pockets. He was watching her. She could feel the weight of his dark gaze pressing against her skin, analyzing, dissecting. He didn't look at her with the leering hunger she was used to from the men in Deacon's circle. He looked at her the way a grandmaster looks at a new piece on the chessboard. "You're bleeding," Domenico stated. The observation was devoid of sympathy, a mere statement of fact. Chenoa touched her lower lip. Her fingers came away stained with bright red. Deacon's ring had caught her when he backhanded her in the coat room. She hadn't even felt it until now. The adrenaline that had fueled her frantic escape was rapidly draining, leaving in its wake a crushing, hollow exhaustion and an agonizing throb in her ribs. "I'm fine," she whispered, her voice rough. She tried to stand, her silk dress pooling around her, but her legs betrayed her, trembling violently. In a fraction of a second, Domenico closed the distance between them. He didn't offer a hand to pull her up. Instead, he gripped her upper arm, his touch firm but surprisingly devoid of the bruising force she expected, and hoisted her to her feet. "Do not lie to me," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "It is a habit I do not tolerate in my presence." Chenoa looked up into his eyes. Up close, they weren't just black. They were a deep, fathomless espresso, glittering with a sharp, terrifying intelligence. She saw no mercy there, but she also saw no chaos. Unlike Deacon, whose violence was born of insecurity and volatile rage, the violence in Domenico Santoro was controlled, weaponized, and entirely purposeful. He was going to kill me, Chenoa managed to say, the truth slipping out before she could bite it back. Deacon Smith is a coward and a fool, Domenico replied smoothly, releasing her arm as she found her balance. He glanced at the floor indicator. 40. The penthouse. But he is a fool who handles money for men who are not fools. What did you do to warrant his public wrath? Nothing. I didn't do anything. Domenico's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Strike one. The elevator chimed, the doors gliding open to reveal not a hallway, but the direct entrance to the St. Regis rooftop penthouse. The space was breathtaking, a sprawling expanse of floor-to-ceiling glass offering a 360-degree view of the glittering Manhattan skyline. Minimalist, modern furniture in dark leather and brushed steel sat upon plush cream-colored rugs. It was a fortress of wealth and power suspended in the clouds. Matteo stepped out first, sweeping the room with a practiced eye before giving a slight nod. Domenico stepped out, gesturing for Chenoa to follow. She hesitated, her bare toes curling against the elevator carpet. You have a choice, Domenico said, pausing in the entryway. He didn't turn around, speaking over his shoulder. You can take this elevator back down to the lobby. The NYPD might be there. Deacon will certainly have his men waiting. Or you can step into my home, and for tonight, you will be untouchable. But know this, if you cross my threshold, you belong to my world until I decide otherwise. Chenoa looked at the open elevator panel, then back at the man who commanded empires with a whisper. Going back down meant certain death. Deacon couldn't afford loose ends, especially not a forensic accountant who had seen his off-the-books ledgers. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Chenoa stepped out of the elevator. The moment her foot touched the hardwood floor of the penthouse, the brass doors closed behind her with a final, decisive click. Matteo! Domenico called out as he stripped off his suit jacket, tossing it carelessly onto a leather sofa. Call Dr. Evans. Tell him to get up here and pour our guest a drink. I don't need a doctor, Chenoa protested weakly, wrapping her arms around herself. The penthouse was heavily air-conditioned, and her backless silk gown offered no protection against the chill. Domenico turned to face her, rolling up the sleeves of his crisp white dress shirt, revealing forearms corded with muscle and dusted with dark hair. You have a contusion forming on your left cheekbone, your lip is split, and based on the way you are guarding your right side, he fractured at least one rib. You will see the doctor. It wasn't a suggestion. Matteo approached, handing her a crystal tumbler filled with 2 fingers of amber liquid. Macallan 25, the enforcer grunted. Drink it. Helps with the shock. Chenoa took the glass with trembling hands. She took a sip, the smooth, peaty fire burning down her throat, momentarily distracting her from the throbbing pain in her chest. Domenico walked over to a massive mahogany desk near the floor-to-ceiling windows and picked up a tablet. He swiped across the screen a few times, the blue light reflecting in his dark eyes. Chenoa Iverson, he read aloud, his accent wrapping around her name like velvet over steel. 32, graduated top of your class from Wharton, employed by Oak Tree Capital for 4 years, promoted to senior auditor 2 years ago. Romantic involvement with Deacon Smith began shortly after. He tossed the tablet onto the desk and looked at her, his expression unreadable. You are a very smart woman, Miss Iverson, Domenico said slowly, pacing toward her. He moved like a predatory cat, silent, fluid, and completely dominant. Which means you did not just stumble into Deacon's bad graces over a domestic squabble. You found something that frightened a man who launders money for the Volkov Bratva. Chenoa's heart stopped. He knows. I don't know what you're talking about, she lied, her voice dropping to a whisper. Domenico stopped inches from her. She had to tilt her head back to look at him. Up close, he smelled of danger and power. He reached out, his large, warm hand gently gripping her chin, forcing her to hold his gaze. Strike 2, he whispered softly, his thumb brushing a hair away from her bruised cheek. Do not give me a third. The private medical examination was brief, efficient, and painfully illuminating. Dr. Evans, a discreet man with tired eyes and hands that rarely shook, confirmed Domenico's assessment. A fractured 7th rib, severe bruising, and a mild concussion. He bound Chenoa's ribs tightly, prescribed rest and painkillers, and vanished back into the night as silently as he had arrived. Now, Chenoa sat curled in the corner of a massive velvet armchair in Domenico's study. A heavy cashmere blanket had been draped over her shoulders by a silent maid named Maria. The warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth did little to thaw the ice in Chenoa's veins. Domenico sat behind his desk, steepling his fingers as he watched her. The room was shrouded in shadows, lit only by the fire and a single desk lamp. "Let us stop playing games, Chenoa," Domenico said, breaking the long silence. "My men have had their ears to the ground for the past hour. Deacon Smith has practically torn the St. Regis apart looking for you. He has mobilized a dozen of his private fixers. He is panicking. Men like Deacon only panic when their own lives are on the line." Chenoa tightened her grip on the cashmere blanket. The Volkov family," Domenico continued, his tone conversational, but his eyes locked onto hers like targeting lasers, "is currently my biggest headache in this city. They are expanding into the ports, disrupting my supply lines. Deacon Smith washes their dirty cash through Oak Tree Capital's offshore accounts. We have known this for months. What we haven't been able to find is the ledger." Domenico stood up, walking slowly around the desk. "If the Volkovs find out Deacon lost their money, or worse, lost the records of their money, they will peel his skin off while he breathes. But Deacon isn't running. He is hunting you." Domenico stopped in front of her chair, leaning down slightly. "Why is he hunting you, Chenoa?" Chenoa squeezed her eyes shut. If she told him, she gave up her only leverage. But if she didn't, she was useless to him. And Domenico Santoro was not a man who kept useless things. "Before the gala," Chenoa started, her voice shaking, "Deacon was in the shower. His briefcase was unlocked. I had been suspicious for months. Numbers weren't adding up. I'm an auditor. It's my job to find anomalies. I started looking into his private files." Domenico remained silent, his intense focus demanding she continue. "I found a hidden partition on his encrypted laptop. I downloaded it." She reached up, her fingers fumbling with the clasp of the delicate silver chain around her neck. Hanging from it was a sleek silver pendant, a custom Cartier piece Deacon had bought her for their anniversary. But it wasn't just jewelry. She twisted the bottom half, pulling it apart to reveal a micro USB drive. She held it out on her trembling palm. "It's all here," she whispered. "The routing numbers, the shell companies in the Caymans, the payout structures to the Volkov lieutenants. Every cent he's washed for them over the past 3 years." Domenico stared at the drive. For a fleeting second, a look of pure, unadulterated triumph flashed across his face, quickly replaced by a terrifyingly cold calculation. He didn't take the drive immediately. Instead, he looked from the metal device in her hand to her pale, bruised face. "You stole the Volkov ledger," he stated softly, almost in awe. "A civilian, an accountant. You robbed the Russian mob right under the nose of their chief launderer." "I was going to go to the FBI," Chenoa pleaded, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "I was going to trade it for immunity and witness protection. But he caught me looking at the briefcase. He didn't know I took the data, but he knew I saw something. That's why he attacked me." Domenico finally reached out, his long fingers plucking the drive from her palm. The metal felt cold, leaving her skin. She had just handed over her only shield. "The FBI would have gotten you killed," Domenico said bluntly, walking back to his desk and tossing the drive onto the polished wood. "They leak like a sieve. The Volkovs have agents on the federal payroll. You would have been dead before the grand jury convened." "Then what do I do?" Chenoa cried, the desperation finally breaking through her stoic facade. "He'll kill me. If I leave here, he'll find me." Domenico sat back down, steepling his fingers once more. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Chenoa felt like a mouse caught between a snake and an eagle. "You are not leaving," Domenico said. Chenoa blinked, the tears momentarily stopping. "What?" This drive," Domenico tapped a finger on the desk, "is the key to dismantling the Volkov operation in New York. With this, I can freeze their assets, expose their lieutenants to the authorities, and choke them out of my city without firing a single bullet. It is invaluable." He looked at her, his expression darkening. "But it also makes you the most dangerous liability in Manhattan. Deacon knows you have it, or at least suspects. The Volkovs will know soon enough. If they capture you, they will torture you until you give up the decryption keys, and then they will find out you gave the drive to me." "I won't tell them anything," Domenico laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that chilled her to the bone. "Everyone talks, Chenoa. Eventually, the human body has limits." He leaned forward, the shadows catching the sharp angles of his face. "You stepped into my elevator to escape a monster," Domenico said, his voice a low, hypnotic rumble. "But you do not realize the bargain you have struck. You gave me the weapon I need to win a war. In exchange, I am going to keep you alive, but you are no longer a free woman." Chenoa's breath hitched, a fresh wave of panic rising in her chest. Are you keeping me hostage?" "I am keeping you breathing," Domenico corrected sharply. "Deacon Smith wants you dead. The Volkovs want you dead. Out there, you are a walking corpse. In here, you are my property. You belong to the Santoro family now. You will live in this penthouse. You will eat what my chef prepares. You will wear what I buy you, and you will not step 1 foot outside these doors without my express permission and a heavily armed escort." "You can't do that," she breathed, horrified. "I'm a person, not a piece of leverage." "You are both," Domenico replied coldly. "And right now, your leverage is the only thing keeping that pretty neck of yours unbroken. Welcome to the family, Miss Iverson." Domenico hit an intercom button on his desk. "Matteo, lock down the penthouse. No one enters or leaves. And put a team on Deacon Smith. I want to know every time the bastard breathes." He released the button and looked back at Chenoa, who was shrinking into the oversized chair, the magnitude of her situation finally crushing down upon her. She hadn't escaped the Mafia. She had just promoted herself to the center of their war. Morning broke over Manhattan in a wash of pale gold, streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the guest suite. Chenoa woke with a sharp gasp, her hand instinctively flying to her bandaged ribs. The dull, persistent ache grounded her, dragging the terrifying events of the previous night out of the realm of nightmares and into stark reality. She was not in her sleek Tribeca apartment. She was in a fortress suspended in the sky, owned by the most dangerous man in New York. She pushed the heavy silk duvet aside and swung her legs over the edge of the California king bed. Her tattered evening gown was gone, replaced during the night by a soft, oversized cashmere sweater and silk lounge pants that had been folded neatly on the chaise lounge, a subtle assertion of control. Domenico Santoro provided for her, but he dictated the terms. Stepping into the main living area of the penthouse, Chenoa found the atmosphere charged with a quiet, lethal efficiency. 4 men in dark suits with earpieces stood at various vantage points, their eyes scanning the perimeter. Matteo, the scarred enforcer from the elevator, stood near the kitchen island, drinking a shot of espresso. Domenico was seated at the massive dining table, a sprawling spread of architectural blueprints and encrypted tablets before him. He wore a crisp black dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, a shoulder holster resting casually over the back of his chair. He didn't look up as she approached, but his voice cut through the low hum of the air conditioning. "Maria left breakfast for you on the counter. Eat, then we have work to do." Chenoa ignored the food, walking straight to the table. "I want my phone." Domenico finally raised his head. The fathomless dark eyes pinned her in place. "Your phone is currently at the bottom of the East River. Deacon had tracking software installed on it. My men found the ping within 3 minutes of sweeping your purse." A cold sweat broke out over her skin. Deacon had been tracking her. The suffocating realization of just how deeply she had been trapped made her stomach churn. "I need to call my sister," Chenoa insisted, her voice trembling but defiant. "She'll be worried. If I just disappear—" "Your sister in Chicago received a text from your phone before it was destroyed," Domenico interrupted smoothly, returning his attention to the tablet. "It stated you and Deacon had a terrible fight. You broke up with him, and you are taking an impromptu leave of absence to travel through Europe. A substantial deposit was made to her bank account from yours to corroborate the story." She is relieved you left him. Chenoa stood frozen, horrified by the sheer terrifying efficiency of his operation. He had erased her life in a matter of hours. You had no right to do that. I have every right, Chenoa. I bought that right when I kept Deacon from snapping your neck in my elevator. Domenico stood, picking up the silver USB drive she had surrendered the night before. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger. My technicians have been trying to crack this for 6 hours. They tell me there's a secondary biometric failsafe and a randomized alphanumeric cipher. Of course there is, Chenoa said, a sliver of professional pride cutting through her fear. It's holding the laundering routes for a multi-billion-dollar syndicate. Deacon isn't a genius, but the men he hires to build his firewalls are. If your men try a brute force attack, the drive will wipe itself. Domenico walked slowly around the table, stopping just inches from her, the scent of cedarwood and danger wrapped around her. You know the cipher. I memorized it, Chenoa confirmed, tilting her chin up. It was her only shield. I have a photographic memory for numbers. It's why I'm a good forensic accountant. And the biometric lock requires a specific sequence of keystrokes that mimic a typing cadence. A slow, dangerous smile curved the corner of Domenico's mouth. It was a terrifying expression, devoid of warmth, but brimming with predatory approval. You truly are a remarkable creature, Miss Iverson. You didn't just steal the ledger. You made yourself the only key to opening it. It means you can't kill me, she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. I never wanted to kill you, Domenico murmured, reaching out. His knuckles brushed lightly against her unbruised cheek, sending a confusing electric jolt down her spine. The touch was unnervingly gentle from hands capable of such violence. But it does mean you are going to sit at my desk, and you are going to open that drive for me. Today. And if I refuse? If I want a guarantee of my freedom first? Domenico leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. You are not in a boardroom, Chenoa. You cannot negotiate from a position of weakness. Out there, Deacon has placed a $2 million bounty on your head. He convinced the Volkovs that you were the mastermind, that you stole their money and framed him. Every hitter in the tri-state area is looking for a blonde accountant with a bruised face. He pulled back, his eyes hard and uncompromising. Open the drive. Give me the ammunition I need to destroy them. Then, and only then, will we discuss your freedom. The study was a sanctuary of dark mahogany, leather, and silence, broken only by the rapid, rhythmic clicking of the mechanical keyboard. Chenoa sat at Domenico's massive desk, 3 high-resolution monitors casting a pale blue glow over her focused features. Domenico stood behind her, an imposing shadow. He had been standing there for 2 hours, watching her work with a silent, unnerving intensity. He didn't pace. He didn't ask questions. He simply watched as she dismantled the intricate digital walls Deacon's people had built. The routing numbers are masked through a series of shell corporations in Geneva, Chenoa explained, her fingers flying across the keys. The complex work was a welcome distraction from the agonizing pain in her ribs and the surreal nightmare her life had become. Deacon used Oaktree Capital's legitimate acquisitions as a smokescreen. When a clean company bought a struggling asset, Deacon would inflate the purchase price. The difference was the Volkovs' dirty money, washed and deposited into offshore accounts disguised as consulting fees. Clever, Domenico noted, his deep voice vibrating right behind her chair. But not foolproof. No, because he had to keep a master ledger to prove to the Volkovs that their money was safe. That's what this is. Chenoa paused, taking a deep breath. I'm at the final firewall. The typing cadence. She closed her eyes, visualizing Deacon's hands on his laptop, the aggressive staccato rhythm he used when he was stressed. She opened her eyes, positioned her fingers, and began to type the 72-character passphrase. The screen froze for agonizing seconds. Then, a green progress bar flashed. The screens exploded with data. Rows upon rows of names, account numbers, shell company identifiers, and wire transfer logs. The lifeblood of the Russian mob laid bare. Dio mio, Domenico breathed, leaning over her shoulder. His hand rested flat on the desk beside her, his body caging her in. You have handed me their throat, Chenoa. Before she could process the proximity of his body or the dark triumph on his voice, the study doors burst open. Matteo strode in, his usually impassive face tight with tension. "Boss, we have a serious problem." Domenico straightened instantly, the aura of the Mafia Don snapping back into place. "Speak." "Deacon didn't just put a bounty on her," Matteo said, his eyes darting to Chenoa. "He gave the Volkovs a target. One of our men down at the docks just got a tip. Ivan Volkov sent a ghost squad. They aren't looking for her on the streets. They know she's here." "Impossible," Domenico snarled, stepping away from the desk. "This building is a fortress. No one gets past the lobby without my authorization." "They aren't coming through the lobby," Matteo said grimly. Crack. The sound was deafening, like a whip striking right next to Chenoa's ear. Time seemed to fracture into slow, jagged pieces. The massive floor-to-ceiling reinforced window to Chenoa's right spiderwebbed violently. A high-caliber sniper round had struck the bulletproof glass, burying itself halfway through the thick layers of polycarbonate. The impact was dead center on where Chenoa's head had been, moments before she leaned forward to look at the screen. "Down!" Domenico roared. He didn't wait for her to react. He lunged across the desk, grabbing her by the waist and dragging her out of the heavy leather chair. Chenoa screamed as her fractured rib protested violently, but the sound was drowned out by a second deafening crack. Another bullet struck the glass, hitting the exact same spot. The reinforced pane groaned, a terrifying sound of structural failure. It wouldn't hold a third shot. Domenico threw her to the floor, covering her body entirely with his own, just as the third shot echoed. The glass shattered inward with the force of an explosion. A shower of jagged, glittering shards rained down over the study. The sudden rush of wind from 40 stories up howled through the breach, sending papers from the desk spiraling into the air like chaotic snow. Chenoa lay pinned beneath Domenico's heavy, muscular frame, trembling uncontrollably. She could hear the rapid, heavy thud of his heart against her back. He had positioned himself perfectly, using his own body as a human shield, taking the brunt of the falling glass on his back and shoulders. "Matteo, kill the lights!" Domenico shouted over the wind. The study plunged into absolute darkness. "Are you hit?" Domenico demanded, his voice a harsh rasp in her ear. His hands moved quickly, expertly over her arms and back, checking for blood. "No," Chenoa stammered, choking on the dust and adrenaline. "I'm okay." Domenico rolled off her, though he kept a heavy hand pressed between her shoulder blades, keeping her flat against the carpet. He pulled a matte black Glock from his shoulder holster, his eyes locked on the shattered window. "Matteo," Domenico said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm, deadened tone, the sound of a man who was about to unleash hell. "Find out which building that shot came from. Send the tactical team. I want the shooter alive. I want to look him in the eyes before I take his hands." "Already on it," Matteo's voice echoed from the darkness near the doorway. Domenico looked down at Chenoa, his face illuminated only by the faint glow of the city lights bleeding through the broken window. The earlier civility, the sophisticated veneer of the businessman, was entirely gone. In its place was the ruthless, absolute king of the underworld. Deacon Smith just made the last mistake of his pathetic life, Domenico promised, his eyes burning with a dark, violent vow. And the Volkovs just signed their own death warrants. He reached down, his hand wrapping securely around her trembling fingers. "Stay down, Chenoa. The war just started." The penthouse, once a silent sanctuary of glass and sky, had become a wind tunnel of chaos. The howling gale from 40 stories up whipped Chenoa's blonde hair across her face, carrying the sharp scent of ozone and the metallic tang of blood. "Move," Domenico ordered, his voice cutting through the roar of the wind. He didn't wait for her muscles to unfreeze. He hoisted her up, his arm wrapping securely around her waist, and practically carried her out of the ruined study. They moved swiftly through the darkened living room, their footsteps crunching over stray fragments of shattered glass. Matteo was already ahead of them, his weapon drawn, sweeping the corridor that led to the private residence wing. Domenico pressed his hand against a seemingly blank wall panel next to a modern art installation. A biometric scanner glowed briefly with a red light, reading his fingerprints and retinal pattern. With a heavy pneumatic hiss, the wall slid back, revealing the titanium-reinforced door of a panic room. "Inside," Domenico commanded, shoving her gently but firmly through the threshold. The heavy door sealed shut behind them, abruptly cutting off the howling wind and plunging them into an eerie, soundproofed silence. The lights flickered on automatically, revealing a stark, utilitarian space outfitted with independent ventilation, a bank of secure communication servers, and an armory that could rival a small military base. Chenoa collapsed onto a sleek stainless steel bench, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The adrenaline was beginning to crash, leaving her body trembling violently. She touched her cheek and winced. When she pulled her fingers away, they were slick with a thin layer of blood. A tiny shard of flying glass had grazed her. Domenico saw it immediately. He crossed the small room, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle ticked in his cheek. He opened a wall-mounted medical kit, pulling out a sterile wipe and a small bandage. "Hold still," he murmured, his tone softening imperceptibly as he knelt before her. He reached out, his large hands she had just seen orchestrate violence with terrifying ease. Gently tilting her chin up, he carefully dabbed the cut on her cheekbone. The sting made her hiss, but she didn't pull away. She looked into his dark eyes, searching for the monster the city claimed he was, but finding only a fierce, possessive protectiveness that made her breath hitch. "I promised you would be safe," Domenico said quietly, his thumb brushing against her uninjured jawline. "I do not break my promises, Chenoa. Whoever pulled that trigger is a dead man, and Ivan Volkov will watch his empire burn to ash before the week is out." Before Chenoa could respond, the secure comms terminal on the desk beeped rapidly. Domenico stood, his warm touch vanishing, instantly replaced by the cold, calculating Mafia dawn. He hit a button on the console. "Talk to me, Matteo," Domenico said into the mic. "The shooter was on the roof of the adjacent commercial tower." Matteo's voice crackled through the speaker, tight with exertion. "My tactical team breached the roof 2 minutes after the shot. The nest was empty, but they found a brass casing, specialized armor piercing, and we found a burner phone taped to the ledge. It was ringing." "Did you answer it?" "Yes, boss." Matteo paused, the silence heavy. "It was Deacon Smith. He told me to tell you that the shot was just a warning. He said he has a secondary ledger, a physical failsafe, and he's given a copy to the district attorney." Chenoa's blood ran cold. "He's lying," she blurted out, standing up despite the pain in her ribs. Domenico muted the mic and turned to her, his brow furrowed. "Explain." "Deacon is arrogant, but he isn't stupid enough to keep a physical copy that could implicate him," Chenoa said, her mind shifting rapidly back to her forensic training. "I tore his digital life apart. There is no secondary ledger. But there is something else. When I was decrypting the drive, I saw a partitioned folder titled Project Icarus. I didn't have time to open it before the window shattered. If Deacon is bluffing about a physical ledger, he might be using it to distract us from what's actually in that folder." Domenico's eyes gleamed with a dangerous intelligence. He looked at the Patek Philippe watch on his wrist, calculating. "We cannot stay here," Domenico decided abruptly, unmuting the console. "Matteo, prep the motorcade in the sub-basement. 3 decoy vehicles, 1 armored Resvani Vengeance for us. We are moving to the vault. And Matteo, bring the encrypted servers from the study. Miss Iverson has more work to do." "Understood. Moving in 5. Domenico turned back to Chenoa, his gaze dropping to her trembling hands. "Are you ready to go to war, mia cara?" Chenoa looked at the man who had just shielded her with his own body. She had nothing left. Her career was gone, her apartment was likely bugged or destroyed, and her ex-boyfriend had put a target on her back. Domenico Santoro was the only wall standing between her and a shallow grave. "Show me your computers," Chenoa said, her voice steadying. "I'll tear him to pieces." The extraction was a blur of tactical precision. Surrounded by heavily armed men, Chenoa was rushed down a secondary freight elevator to the St. Regis's lowest parking level. The air was thick with the scent of exhaust and tension. She was shoved into the back of a matte black Resvani Vengeance, an armored SUV that looked more like a military tank than a luxury vehicle. Domenico slid in beside her, the heavy doors slamming shut with a vault-like thud. The convoy sped out into the Manhattan night, the decoy vehicles splitting off at different intersections to confuse any tails. 30 minutes later, they arrived at a nondescript meatpacking warehouse in the Bronx. The exterior was rusting and decrepit, but as the SUV rolled over a massive industrial elevator platform, they descended deep underground into a world of hyper-modern security. The vault, as Domenico called it, was a sprawling subterranean bunker. Originally a Prohibition-era smuggling hub, it had been retrofitted with state-of-the-art technology, blast doors, and a command center that rivaled NORAD. The walls were reinforced concrete, lined with screens displaying security feeds from across the city. "Get her set up on the mainframe," Domenico ordered a technician as they stepped out of the vehicle. He turned to Chenoa, slipping off his suit jacket. "Find Project Icarus. I need to know what Deacon is hiding." Chenoa was immediately ushered to a massive curved workstation. Her fingers danced across the mechanical keyboard, bypassing the vault's internal firewalls with credentials Domenico provided. She linked the encrypted servers Matteo had salvaged from the penthouse to the mainframe. "I'm in," Chenoa announced, the green light of the screen reflecting in her eyes. The decryption key held, opening the Icarus partition now. Domenico stood behind her, his hands resting on the back of her chair. The physical proximity was grounding, a heavy anchor in the storm of code and data. Lines of text began to cascade across the massive monitors. Chenoa's eyes darted back and forth, her brain processing the numbers at lightning speed. Suddenly, she gasped, her hands freezing over the keys. "What is it?" Domenico demanded, leaning closer. "It's not just the Volkovs," Chenoa whispered, horror creeping into her voice. "Deacon didn't just launder money for the Russians. He's been double-dipping." She clicked a few folders, pulling up wire transfer logs disguised as corporate dividends. "Look at these routing numbers." Chenoa pointed to a specific offshore account in the Seychelles. "These deposits align perfectly with the dates of your supply shipments coming through the docks, the shipments that were supposedly seized by customs last year." Domenico's entire body went rigid. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "He was skimming off my family," Domenico stated, his voice a lethal, vibrating hum. "Not just skimming," Chenoa corrected, her fingers flying again, pulling up emails and encrypted chat logs. "He was feeding your shipping manifests to the Volkovs. The Volkovs intercepted your shipments, sold the goods, and Deacon washed the profits for a 20% cut. Deacon is the reason the Russians have been expanding so fast. He funded their war against you using your own money." A terrifying silence descended over the command center. The technicians and guards present kept their eyes averted, pretending not to hear the massive revelation. Domenico stepped back from the chair. He didn't yell. He didn't throw anything. But the cold, dead look in his eyes was far more terrifying than any outburst of rage. He was a king who had just discovered the rat in his throne room. "Matteo," Domenico said quietly. The enforcer stepped forward from the shadows. "Boss, I want Deacon Smith alive. I don't care how many men you have to put on the street. I don't care what you have to burn down. Bring him to me." Before Matteo could acknowledge the order, the command center's main alarm system began to wail, a harsh, pulsing red light bathing the concrete walls. "Sir," a technician shouted over the siren, "we have a breach at the outer perimeter. The warehouse security doors have been compromised." "Show me," Domenico barked. The main monitor switched from Chenoa's data to a live feed of the warehouse above. 3 unmarked tactical vans had smashed through the loading dock doors. Heavily armed men in black tactical gear were swarming the floor, planting explosive charges on the industrial elevator platform. "The Volkovs!" Matteo grunted, racking the slide of his assault rifle. "They didn't just track us, they brought an army." Chenoa shrank back in her chair. "How did they find us? The decoy cars, the armored SUV. It shouldn't have been possible." "It isn't possible," Domenico said, his eyes scanning the room, landing on each of his men with a paranoid, lethal intensity. "Not unless someone told them exactly where we were going." He looked back at the monitors. The mercenaries above were setting up a shaped charge directly over the primary blast doors. "We have a mole," Domenico declared, pulling his Glock from its holster, "and we are trapped." He turned to Chenoa, the ruthless Mafia boss seamlessly shifting back into the protector. "Take the drive. Disconnect it from the mainframe. Now." Chenoa scrambled to eject the USB, her hands shaking so badly she dropped it onto the desk before snatching it up. She clutched it to her chest like a lifeline. "Matteo, lock down the secondary tunnels. We hold the choke point at the elevator shaft," Domenico ordered, his voice echoing in the cavernous bunker. He grabbed Chenoa by the arm, pulling her away from the glowing screens and into the shadows of the armory. "If they breach those doors," Domenico whispered to her, the sounds of distant muffled explosions echoing from above. "You do not hesitate, and you do not look back. You run down the ventilation access tunnel. It leads to the subway lines." "I'm not leaving you," Chenoa choked out, the thought of running into the dark alone terrifying her more than the men with guns. Domenico's hand cupped the back of her neck, pulling her forehead against his. Amidst the blaring alarms and the scent of impending violence, the touch was shockingly intimate. "You hold the key to my empire in your hands, Chenoa," he murmured, his dark eyes burning into hers. "You are more valuable than my life. You run. I will find you." A massive, concussive boom shook the very foundations of the bunker, knocking dust from the concrete ceiling. The blast doors groaned. The war hadn't just started. It had arrived at their front door. Concrete dust rained down like heavy snow as the secondary explosive charge detonated, blowing the reinforced steel blast doors completely off their massive hinges. The deafening roar vibrating through the underground bunker was immediately followed by the terrifying synchronized staccato of automatic gunfire. "Cover!" Domenico roared, shoving Chenoa roughly behind the reinforced server racks of the command center. A dozen mercenaries flooded through the smoke-filled breach. They were professionals, not typical street thugs, outfitted in authentic Cry precision tactical gear and wearing panoramic night vision goggles. Green laser sights sliced through the hazy air, hunting for targets. Matteo and the remaining bunker guards opened fire, their weapons flashing violently in the dim, pulsing red emergency light. Chenoa curled into a tight ball, clutching the silver USB drive against her chest. The sound was agonizing, shouts in Russian, the sickening thud of bullets hitting Kevlar and flesh, the shattering of monitors. Suddenly, a hand clamped down on her shoulder, gripping her tattered cashmere sweater. She screamed, thrashing wildly, expecting to see a masked Russian mercenary. Instead, she looked up into the panicked, sweat-streaked face of Garrick, Domenico's lead communications technician. "Give me the drive, Chenoa!" Garrick yelled over the gunfire, his eyes darting frantically toward the breach. He held a sleek Sig Sauer pistol, but it wasn't pointed at the door. It was pointed at her. "Give it to me, and they let us live." The mole. Chenoa froze, her mind instantly connecting the dots. Garrick had access to the bunker's location. He had access to the security feeds. He had sold them out. "No," Chenoa gasped, scrambling backward on the floor, her fractured ribs screaming in agony. "I'm not dying for him." Garrick snarled, lunging forward to pry the drive from her hands. Before his fingers could graze her skin, a massive shadow eclipsed the emergency lights. Domenico moved with a terrifying, fluid violence. He didn't say a word. He grabbed Garrick by the tactical vest, hauled him effortlessly to his feet, and slammed him face first into the steel server rack with bone-shattering force. Garrick crumpled instantly to the floor, unconscious before he even landed. Domenico didn't pause. He grabbed Chenoa's arm, hauling her up. "Ventilation tunnel, now!" They sprinted through the shadows of the armory, Matteo providing suppressing fire from behind a concrete pillar. The enforcer was bleeding from a graze on his cheek, but grinning like a madman, fully in his element. "Go, boss, I'll hold the choke point." Domenico hit a hidden panel on the back wall of the armory. A heavy industrial grate slid open, revealing a dark, narrow shaft. He pushed Chenoa inside first, then climbed in behind her, hitting the manual override to slam the grate shut and lock it, just as a hail of bullets sparked against the metal. The tunnel was suffocatingly tight, smelling of rust, damp earth, and ancient grease. Chenoa crawled forward on her hands and knees in total darkness, the metal grating tearing at her silk lounge pants. Behind her, she could hear Domenico's heavy breathing and occasionally a sharp, suppressed grunt of pain. "Are you okay?" she whispered frantically over her shoulder, the sounds of the firefight growing muffled behind them. "Keep moving," he ordered, his voice tight, devoid of its usual smooth baritone. They crawled for what felt like an eternity, the air growing colder and damper. Finally, the tunnel opened up into a cavernous, echoing space. Chenoa tumbled out onto a ledge, coughing as she inhaled the distinctly sour metallic air of the New York City subway system. They had emerged onto an abandoned maintenance catwalk overlooking the rusted tracks of the old City Hall station loop. Domenico climbed out after her, but as his boots hit the concrete, his legs buckled. He collapsed against the grimy, tiled wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor. "Domenico!" Chenoa rushed to his side, her eyes adjusting to the faint flickering light of a distant maintenance bulb. He had taken his suit jacket off in the bunker, and his crisp black dress shirt was now heavily saturated with a dark, glistening stain on his left side. A Russian round had bypassed his Kevlar plating, catching him just below the ribs. "It is a through and through," Domenico rasped, his head falling back against the tiles. He offered a faint, grim smile, messy, but it missed the vital organs. "I will live." "You're bleeding everywhere," Chenoa panicked, tearing at the hem of her cashmere sweater. She ripped a long strip of the expensive fabric, her hands shaking violently. She pressed the makeshift bandage hard against the entry wound. Domenico hissed, his hand instantly flying up to grip her wrist. His fingers were cold, but his grip was still like iron. He looked at her, truly looked at her. Her blonde hair was matted with concrete dust, her face bruised and streaked with soot and tears, her clothes ruined. Yet, as she pressed her weight against his bleeding side to stem the flow, she didn't look like a terrified hostage anymore. She looked fierce. She looked like a survivor. "Why didn't you run?" Domenico asked softly, his thumb tracing the frantic pulse at her wrist. "In the bunker. When Garrick had the gun, you could have given him the drive and walked away." Chenoa swallowed hard, her eyes locking onto his espresso dark gaze. "Because you shielded me from the glass. You promised to keep me safe. I don't abandon my partners." The word hung in the damp, freezing air of the subway tunnel. Partners, not property, not a hostage. Domenico's lips curved into a genuine, slow smile that reached his eyes, banishing the cold mafia king and leaving behind a man who was utterly captivated. "Partners," he agreed, his voice a low, rough rumble. "Let us get out of this sewer, partner. We have an empire to burn." 72 hours later, the world had shifted on its axis. The safe house was a sprawling, secluded glass and timber estate, nestled deep in the heavily wooded mountains of the Catskills, heavily guarded by a fresh rotation of Domenico's most loyal soldiers. Inside, the crackle of a massive stone fireplace provided a stark contrast to the cold digital war being waged on the dining room table. Domenico sat in a leather armchair by the fire, his torso heavily bandaged, sipping a glass of Barolo. The bullet had missed his spleen by millimeters, but Dr. Evans had patched him up with his usual terrifying discretion. Chenoa sat at this dining table, her fingers flying across the keys of a secure laptop. The bruises on her face were fading to a dull yellow, but the naive fear that had once clouded her eyes was entirely gone. It had been replaced by a sharp, calculating focus. "The final transfers are complete," Chenoa announced, leaning back in her chair and crossing her arms. She didn't wear borrowed silk anymore. She wore fitted dark jeans and a black turtleneck, looking every inch the architect of the chaos currently unfolding in Manhattan. "Give me the damage report," Domenico said, setting his wine glass down. Chenoa turned the laptop screen toward him. "Using Chainalysis software, I untangled the Volkov's entire cryptocurrency laundering network. But I didn't send it to the FBI. The feds take months to build a case. I sent the decrypted ledger anonymously to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division and CC'd the top 3 rival syndicates in Brighton Beach." Domenico chuckled, a dark, rich sound. "You threw blood in the shark tank." "Exactly. The Volkovs' bank accounts in the Caymans, Switzerland, and the Seychelles have been completely frozen by international authorities. Their rivals are already moving in on their territory. Ivan Volkov is currently running for his life. Chenoa paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. As for your money, the funds Deacon skimmed from your shipping lines over the past 3 years. Consider it lost. Domenico waved a hand dismissively. The cost of doing business with a rat. No, Chenoa corrected, a small, triumphant smile playing on her lips. I'm a very good accountant, Domenico. I tracked every penny Deacon stole from you. I didn't freeze those accounts. I drained them. I routed the funds through 6 different shell corporations and deposited $94 million into a secure, untraceable Swiss account under the Santoro Holding Company. Domenico stared at her, genuinely stunned. The Don of the East Coast, a man who rarely felt anything resembling surprise, was utterly speechless. He slowly pushed himself up from the armchair, walking toward her with a predatory grace that his injury barely hindered. You stole $94 million back from the Russian mob? He asked softly, resting his hands on the table on either side of her, boxing her in. I audited them, Chenoa corrected, her breath hitching slightly at his proximity. And I balanced the ledger. And Deacon? Domenico asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Matteo intercepted him at Teterboro Airport an hour ago, Chenoa said, her voice turning cold. He was trying to board a private jet to a non-extradition country. Matteo didn't kill him. He simply confiscated his passport, tied him to a chair in the hangar, and sent an anonymous text to the Volkov lieutenants with his exact GPS coordinates. Let them deal with the man who lost their money. Domenico leaned down, his face inches from hers. The scent of cedarwood, expensive wine, and danger wrapped around her, making her heart hammer a frantic, entirely different kind of rhythm than it had in the elevator 4 days ago. The war is won, Domenico murmured, his eyes dropping to her lips. The Volkovs are broken. Deacon is a dead man walking. You have no bounty on your head, Chenoa. You are perfectly safe. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted black smartphone, setting it on the laptop keyboard. That phone contains the credentials to a private offshore account holding $10 million. It is your cut of the recovered funds. Clean, untraceable money, Domenico said, his voice entirely devoid of its usual commanding edge. It was almost vulnerable. There is a car waiting outside. It will take you to JFK. You can go anywhere in the world. You are free, Chenoa. Chenoa looked down at the phone. It represented everything she had wanted when she ran down that hallway at the St. Regis. Freedom, safety, a clean slate. She picked up the phone. The sleek black metal felt cold in her hand. Then, without breaking eye contact with Domenico, she dropped it into the half-empty glass of Barolo on the table. The device bubbled and short-circuited instantly, sinking to the bottom of the red wine. Domenico's eyes widened, a flash of pure, possessive fire igniting in the dark depths. You told me something in the penthouse, Chenoa said softly, standing up. She was smaller than him, but she held her ground, reaching out to gently trace the lapel of his shirt. You said if I crossed your threshold, I belonged to your world until you decided otherwise. I just decided otherwise, Domenico rasped, his hands hovering inches from her waist, fighting the instinct to pull her against him. I am giving you an out. If you stay, there's no going back to the light. You will be the queen of a very dark kingdom. The light was where I met Deacon. The light was where I was weak, Chenoa whispered, closing the final inch between them. She slid her hands up his chest, wrapping her arms around his neck. I don't want an out, Domenico. I want the kingdom. With a low groan, Domenico's restraint snapped. His hands banded around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, careful of his injury, but desperate in his hold. He kissed her with the same ruthless, consuming intensity he applied to his empire, devouring, possessive, and entirely absolute. Chenoa kissed him back, the taste of red wine and adrenaline sealing her fate. She had run into that elevator seeking shelter from a monster. She never expected that the devil in the bespoke suit would be the one to finally set her free. If this pulse-pounding descent into the criminal underworld kept you on the absolute edge of your seat, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button to show your support for Chenoa's epic transformation from a terrified hostage to a ruthless mafia queen. Share this video with your friends who crave dark romance, high-stakes drama, and jaw-dropping plot twists. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our thrilling original stories. Leave a comment below, telling us what you thought of Domenico's final test. Stay tuned for more.